be talking about the topic of Gallaudet in the early years. Our first speaker is Meredith Peruzzi. She's a graduate of Gallaudet in 2011. Her research focuses on the university's history. In her undergraduate career, for her seniors honors capstone course, she focused on Gallaudet from 1864 to 1880. Currently, she is the curator of the Gallaudet Museum and manager of as well. She is working with the Gallaudet 150 Years and Beyond exhibit in the museum. She'll be talking about Platt, Skinner, and the founding of Gallaudet University. We know there's an instrumental figure that he was in Gallaudet's history. He established the first Washington, D.C. school for deaf children, and then as a result of the children being abused, Amos Kendall came on the scene and looked after the children from that point on. Skinner was against slavery. He moved on from D.C. to establish a school for the deaf in New York. However, without his original school, we have to wonder as to whether or not Gallaudet would ever have been founded. I also wanted to take this opportunity to introduce our second speaker. And I wanted to mention as well that if we should have enough time after the presentations, we'll be taking on questions. I wanted to introduce now Chris and Kim Kurz, the Associate Professor in Secondary Education Program at RIT in Rochester, New York, has a doctoral degree in Foundations of Education from the University of Kansas. He's a strong supporter of math and science programs in the K through 12 education. He's involved in deaf studies and also the STEM classroom programs for deaf children. Teaches in the ASL program, Kim Kurz teaches in the American Sign Language Pedagogical Methods in Education of Interpreters. She has 2 books that she's written, Learning Outcomes of American Sign Language, levels 1 through 4. And also as well speaks to psychological aspects of the deaf experience. They'll be speaking on the topic of Amos Draper at Gallaudet, his legacy as a student, professor, mentor, friend, and caretaker, looking at the contributions that he's made to the history of this university. They'll be looking at his legacy as he's worked through a number of years in his career, always looking to raise the standards of education here at Gallaudet for the students. Draper was a role model for a number of deaf students who passed through his doors at Chapel Hall. So we look forward to 2 wonderful presenters, and I'll ask now Meredith to give her speech, and then afterwards we'll be opening the floor for questions and answers.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm going to talk about the education of deaf children here in America and how the intersections of race, religion, abuse, lies, all come together and have an impact on the founding of education in the United States and how Platt Skinner had an impact on that as well. Many people are unaware of Platt Skinner's background and his story. Throughout his research, I found great inaccuracies and contradictions. Some of that information some information on Skinner is severely lacking. And it's really vague as to what his relationship is towards the founding of Gallaudet University. There are many people who are of the belief that Amos Kendall was actually, and Edward Minor Gallaudet were the primary founders of Gallaudet University, yet there is much more to say about this story. Skinner's story starts in Plattsburgh in central New York State. He was in 1824. He attended Oberlin College, which was a hotbed of abolitionism at the time. Therefore, because of those influences, he became an abolitionist himself. After that time, after his graduation, actually, he moved to New York, where, interestingly enough, he became a dentist, and then that changed his prior plans of being a minister, and then he became a dentist. During that time is when he made a connection to the deaf community. He met a young deaf woman by the name of Jerusha Hills. She was a graduate of the New York School for the Deaf. And she actually became a teacher in that school. They met and they married, and it was Reverend Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet who ministered their wedding. And he's actually the son of Thomas Hopkins Gallaudet, the one that we know that the college is named after. So after 12 years, they traveled the country. They experienced many challenges and struggles. And the worst of those challenges and struggles that they encountered was right here in Washington, D.C. His goal was to teach deaf children, and not just deaf children, but also blind children. This was their goal as a couple, to be able to educate impoverished deaf and blind children so that they would be able to have an education. And because of those religious, and because they wanted to also teach them the religious gospel, he founded the Home for Colored Defectives, which means that black, deaf, and blind children were all accepted into his school. This was in 1854. The next year, someone in that community actually complained about the fact that he was educating these children, and this became taxpayer responsibility, and that these children were not productive members of society and had to be subsidized by taxpayers' monies. Therefore, this occurred in 1864 in New Jersey, where some of those, 1854 in New Jersey, where some of those objections came up from persons living within the area. At that point, he decided to move to Washington, D.C. Now he arrives in our nation's capital. Skinner and his wife at the time, who was pregnant, traveled with 5 children who were all orphans. The research is murky on this fact as to where the origin of these children. One of the myths is that the children were all sons and daughters of escaped fugitives who came from Canada, but that was later found to be untrue. And here is the registry where we actually found the list of the orphans, and this was found here at Kendall School. And this is the 1860 census. It shows that these children were all born in New York State, with the exception of Anne, who was born in Poland. It's important to remember that these were orphans with no biological parents. But later on, Skinner would refute that fact and said that the children were actually given to him in order for him to educate them, and that their parents were still alive. The question then arises is why, if these are truly children who have biological parents who are still alive, why would they have been brought to orphans' court with Skinner? So therefore, it's verified that they actually were orphans. Let's go back to the year 1856, when Skinner first arrived to Washington, D.C. Right after that, he gives birth to a son. At that point, he moves to C and 4.5 Streets in Northwest, the area where currently the D.C. Superior Court is located. At that point, he started searching out deaf and blind children and establishes a school. He wanted to increase the number of students that he was educating. At the same time, he begins soliciting funds. And that is actually the start of Amos's Kendall's connection to deaf education in the nation's capital. Amos Kendall already had some knowledge of the deaf community and deaf culture because remember he was very good friends with Samuel Morse, who created the telegraph and the inventor of that. Samuel Morse's wife was deaf, which means that Amos Kendall had some knowledge of the deaf community and perhaps maybe knew a few signs. But his involvement with deaf education arose when Skinner requested his support. At that point, Kendall provided Skinner with housing. This was on G Street between 20th and 21st, where the International Monetary Fund is today. The house at this point is not there anymore, but this is where they resided during the winter. And what happened is that actually this home was going to be prepared for them. Kendall offered them to stay in his home in Kendall Green until the home was prepared, and then during the spring is when they actually moved in to the residence. The school was established, and then other well-known members of the Washington community were asked to be part of the board. Skinner's original plan was to teach both deaf and blind students. This is the original name of the school, which is the Columbia Institution for the Deaf and Dumb and the Blind. That didn't originate with Edward Minor Gallaudet. That actually originated with Skinner's own experience of teaching children and his desire to also teach blind children. During the fall of 1856, there were letters that were written back and forth between Kendall and Skinner, and a dispute arose. They could not come to an agreement regarding the establishment of the school. At that time, it was decided that Skinner would not be a part of the board, that he would be part of the operations of the school as an administrator and principal. Because of these disagreements that arose, Skinner then decided to keep all of his documentation and run the school on his own. At that point, Kendall felt that his reputation and his name were taken advantage of. He was a reputable community member, and he felt that Skinner took advantage of that for his own profit and means. He therefore decided to publish information in a newspaper and disseminate that regarding Skinner, basically disparaging his character as him being untrustworthy, and sending out a warning to the community about such. During this dispute, Kendall said, if you're not cooperating, then I would like all of the papers back and also the funding and the house to be returned. Skinner then said that he was innocent and he was still in need of aid. Kendall refused to provide him with that aid, despite the fact that Skinner said that they were hungry and in need of housing and in a difficult financial situation. As this correspondence battle is ensuing, Platt Skinner is accused of a crime. Witness testimony says that Skinner was not feeding the children sufficiently. When they were sick, he would not provide them with medical care, and that the children were in a deplorable situation, and that they were being basically abused. They would also be forced to perform acts, demonstrate acts of, for instance, the value of education. He would bring them to wealthy community members and have them play out certain things. He would have the blind children dance and the deaf children sign poems or something of the sort. He obliged them to do this even though they were tired and exhausted. It is well documented by witness testimony that this is what occurred. And as children went to these homes to perform these acts that Skinner was forcing them to do, they would ask the wealthy homeowners for food. And that's where some of the testimony arose as to the maltreatment of these children. He had those 5 children and more that were under his care. There was one child that was actually able to escape and return to his home and complain about the mistreatment. Skinner came to refute that. However, the parents said that my child is very weak and impoverished and starving, and refused to allow their child to go back under Skinner's care. In 1857, he was charged with assault and battery against 8 students, including those original 5 orphans. Let's talk about how that abuse was actually identified. There was a son of a washerwoman who worked for a board member whose name is James C. McGuire. The mother complained to the board member that her son was not being taken care of. At that point, McGuire and Kendall, obviously upset at the news, went to the house on G Street, found that the home was locked. They broke through the doors, and as Kendall later writes, he saw the children, and I quote, moaning piteously, screaming out because of their condition. The children were taken away, and the school was closed. Kendall at that point made a determination that he would not be able to continue educating people, Skinner that is. Therefore, he went to orphans court and received the charges that were against him, that the city brought against him. In April of 1957, this is all happening simultaneously. In 1857, there was a trial, and said that the other students were able to return to their homes, but those 5 orphans had no place to stay. During this day trial, the children was called to court to testify, and Skinner claimed that he had no idea where the children were at the time. Later it was found out that his wife had hand-called a cab and took the children to a train, and they were trying to escape to Baltimore. The police gave chase, found the children and Mrs. Skinner, and brought them back to Washington. The charges of abuse were proven, and custody of the children were given over to Kendall. However, Skinner decided to go ahead and establish the Columbia Institution. Interpreter correction, Kendall decided to go ahead and establish the Columbia Institution and end his relationship with Skinner. And Kendall found the land and had the buildings and the structure, and was able to bring in Edward Minor Gallaudet in order to administer that school. But that's not the end of the story, especially not for Skinner. Skinner, his wife, and his infant son head to Niagara City, New York. Their goal is to teach black children because of their abolitionist spirit. And their new school is limited to only educating black children. It's right on the border of the United States and Canada. And it seems as if the school is quite successful in their mission. Many of the school's publications actually mention the accomplishments of Skinner. And the school is named the School for the Instruction of the Colored, Deaf, Dumb, and Blind. They had a newspaper that people would subscribe to, as you can see here. There was one local newspaper that actually received correspondence from Washington, D.C., from the Columbia Institution Board, warning them of Skinner and his reputation and what had occurred in Washington, D.C. The newspaper decided to publish the letter, but the school continued in existence. It didn't seem that that threatened its continuing mission of educating children. In 1860, they returned to New Jersey for a variety of reasons. New York is cold, and we have, African American children who were used to living in the South in a warmer climate. And also he wanted to be closer to a slave state where he could expand the number of students. So that's why he decided to move to New Jersey and go back home to his area in a rural setting. He asked permission from the state legislature to become an official school on record. The New Jersey School for the Deaf was founded later on in 1860, in the 1880s, correction. But in 1866, Skinner became sick with typhoid fever and suddenly passed. The children left the school. His wife was left alone with a small son at the age of 10. She only had one teenage student that stayed on to help, but she was unable to operate the school on her own. She disseminated information through the Mute and Blind newspaper, asking for funds, but because of her inability to continue, the school was dissolved. The wife decided to travel, and as she was traveling, the teenage student stayed at home, but the home caught on fire, and so she was left destitute. And it's alleged that anti-abolitionists were the ones who destroyed the family home and left her with nothing. That's the closing of the Skinner School, but it's still not the end of the story. In 1893, there was a man working for the Volta Bureau who was writing on the history of schools for the deaf in the United States. Skinner's wife took it upon herself to write to school and implore him to not forget about her husband and implore him not to include the trouble that happened with Amos Kendall. She mentioned that her husband was a good man. The question is left unanswered. Many questions are left unanswered, actually. Was Platt Skinner truly an abuser? Was he an educator? When he founded the school in New York, he was so successful. However, here in Washington, D.C., he's accused of being an abuser. So he has a very contradictory legacy. One personal example, for instance, of his legacy is of that young girl, Anne Zimanowski. She was brought under the tutelage of Skinner at the age of 12. She was admitted to Kendall School and also admitted to Gallaudet College. She was the first female student here at the college. Edward Minor Gallaudet later said that she would have been able to complete her studies because of her brilliance. However, she decided to work in the government, in the Treasury Department. And it's noted that she's probably the first woman who worked for the federal government, the first deaf woman who worked for the federal government. She decided, however, to marry and continue on that trajectory in her life. So let's think about the implications for us today. If this connection did not happen with Kendall, would we have Gallaudet University today? If he had not abused those children, if he had not partnered with Kendall, there are all these ifs that are left for us to answer as to whether or not we would be in existence today. The history and his legacy is quite murky. Just imagine, is it possible that if he had not abused those children, that Gallaudet University would not be in existence? Those questions are left unanswered, and further research needs to be done for further findings. And I'd like to give special thanks to the following individuals. Thank you.
So we are thrilled to be here to share some of our research and talk about Dr. Amos G. Draper. And we will talk about his involvement with the college. So I'm going to call him Draper so that we do not confuse him with Amos Kendall. And we do not have any signs yet associated with him, and so from here forward, I will call him Draper. So I spoke with President Hurwitz yesterday at the opening of the museum, and we were talking about sharing stories. And so here's my opportunity to share his story, and some of the memories of students who were his apprentices. So Dr. Draper had many different roles. He was a teacher, a student, an advocate, a caretaker, and an activist. We'll start at the early years when Draper was first found to be deaf. So he was born hearing in 1845. But my story begins when he became deaf. So he was born in Shaftesbury, Vermont. If everybody knows where the deaf school is in Brattleboro, this is very close to where that is, in Shaftesbury. That town is now North Bennington. And North Bennington is very famous for millwork, for waterways. So until about the age of 9 or 10, he was hearing. At that time, he was playing with a group of boys and fell through a thin piece of ice as they were skating. So they would break up these blocks of ice and bring them home to chill the food, but the boys would play on this ice. The game was called Going Cootie, and they would jump from the blocks of ice that were floating now in the water to the other side of the lake, which is a very risky and dangerous game. Draper's friend slipped and fell into the water, which was extremely cold, as you can imagine. And Draper went ahead and jumped in after him to save his life. So Draper saved his friend's life and yet hit his own head and fell back into the water, which then another friend went in and saved him. When he woke from unconsciousness, he was drenched and cold, but he did not go home, and he stayed to play for the rest of the day. That night, you can imagine, he became very ill, developed a severe fever, and was sick for weeks upon end. And by the end of his illness, he was deaf. So because of this game that he played, he became ill and hence was deaf thereafterward.
So we've spoken to how Draper became deaf, and he began working with his father. He had a tool company. He would make augers and hammers and other types of tools with his father. When he decided to return to school, he went to the American School for the Deaf. And you can see there that was in 1860. As a student at the School for the Deaf, it was described as he was entered a bit about his character. In fact, one of the individuals who assessed Draper mentioned his intellect, his ability to read and write, and that he was able to articulate into spoken English. And he did have some geography and arithmetic skills as well. Sam Porter was one of his teachers, and they had four well-known classmates. John Hotchkiss being one of his classmates. Hotchkiss actually was the first deaf faculty member here at Gallaudet, and Draper then went on to become the second deaf faculty member of this university.
At that time, he was involved in a high-class society. So after 7 years of school, he decided to, because there were no colleges yet for the deaf, stayed in school for 2 extra years.
At the school, very early on, he had developed literacy skills, of course, and he began working on the school newspaper. It was called the Gallaudet Guide. And he became fascinated with writing and journalism as a result of those early years of writing.
So in 1862, he left ASD and went to Illinois. In Danville, Illinois, he worked in the printing office because he had had experience with the Gallaudet Guide newspaper. There he did printing, and he published articles about politics, also about abolitionism. Illinois at that time was a hotbed of discussion regarding this issue. Many people had heated arguments about slavery, and he printed articles about that. At one time, a group of protesters wanted to arrest those who worked in the printing industry and that office, including Draper, but because of their abolitionist stance and because of the work that they did, that did not happen. And then he went on to Aurora, Illinois, where he also continued to work in the newspaper industry. He then got a letter from John Hotchkiss encouraging him to come to Gallaudet College. Although he was happy at the time and enjoyed his work in the printing industry, he knew that Washington, D.C. was the center of American politics with a lot of high esteemed people here and a lot of potential for his own growth. And so he came to D.C. with the idea that he would stay for 1 year and then go back to Illinois. Of course, he came for 1 year and ended up staying for the rest of his career.
So as we mentioned, after he graduated from ASD, because of the urgings of Hotchkiss, he came to this area and began working with the goal of meeting political figures. While he was a student here at Gallaudet, he was very interested in reading and writing, and he established 2 clubs, literacy clubs actually, as well as 1 theater club. Also interesting to note at that time, Edward Minor Gallaudet needed a personal secretary to write correspondence to individuals. And he thought about who would be the perfect person for this job and asked Draper if he'd be willing to become his personal secretary. Draper did so, and as a result, we can see how good he was in his writing, as reflected in the correspondence we have that he did for Edward Minor Gallaudet.
So Draper graduated with the class of 1872 after 4 years in the college, then went to Europe and traveled around, visiting all the different schools for the deaf there. And Edward Minor Gallaudet then asked him to come back to the college and work as a tutor, which he then did. He focused as a tutor for math and Latin, then became an assistant professor for both math and Latin, and eventually became a faculty member. So that 1 year that he planned to stay in Washington, D.C., ended up being a lifetime here in D.C. So he was here for 49 years. We're going to talk a bit about Amos Draper's various roles and begin with his role as a teacher.
Well, Draper was well known for his precision and his punctuality. He was very strict. For example, when he was writing, every single I had to be dotted, every comma had to be in its right place, and he expected the same of his students, so he had very high, rigorous standards in place. And he would often encourage the students to live up to those expectations, always looking for precision in their work. Hotchkiss wrote about him that he also was very punctual and insisted that he be en route to where he needed to be at least 8 minutes before the start of the class. If he was in his office working and had an office appointment, again, he expected people to arrive at least 8 minutes before their appointment. He wanted students to be at class on time, and if they actually showed up at the start of class on time, he considered them late. He believed that 8 minutes early was actually what was considered on time. That was basically the philosophy he worked with. He would write on the chalkboard, and every now and then, if there was a mistake, what would happen, we would see Draper's foot beginning to tap. And the tapping of the foot was a signal to the other students that they needed to improve upon the work they were doing. That was a well-known symbol within the student body that if that foot was a tapping, they needed to be improving upon the work that they were doing at the board.
Sports was very important in Draper's life. He was a big proponent of sports, although education came first. So he involved the idea of baseball in his classroom. So we just told you about his foot tapping, but then also, if a student did something wrong, he would say, "Strike one," which meant the students knew they needed to try again, which they then would. Once they made their adjustments, if they were still not on the mark, he would say, "Strike two," and nobody wanted to be out. But if they tried again and didn't quite meet up to his expectations, he would then say, "You're out." So one student actually wrote about how he taught his classes and how he used baseball in his teaching and how he actually used strike one, strike two on a regular basis. And the student experienced being out in his class. The student tried to convince Draper that it was only a foul, that that last out was not an out. And Draper's response was, yes, it was a foul, and yet you are still out because I caught the ball. And the student then was forced to take a seat. This indicates that he absolutely gave his students the encouragement and the support that they needed to take second chances and continue on their quest to do better.
So we've spoken about him as a teacher, but he also functioned in the role as a mentor. He was a wonderful mentor for a number of people here at Gallaudet, faculty and students alike. The Buff and Blue actually published an article that was written by James Stewart. He was the first editor of the Buff and Blue. And he approached Edward Minor Gallaudet wanting to have Gallaudet have a newspaper established here on campus. And Gallaudet suggested that this student approach Hotchkiss as well as Draper so that they could become faculty advisors to the students who were running the newspaper. The Buff and Blue has served over 100 years as a student newspaper, and much appreciation goes to Draper and his involvement in getting the students' activism expressed through the newspaper.
Draper was also a chaperone. Our next presentation is going to be talking about women and women's role in the university. And we know that women were not permitted to travel on their own. So always they required a chaperone by a male. And so Draper sometimes would chaperone and accompany these women downtown or to other specific buildings in the city. There's one story that tells about a woman who wanted to go to Georgetown and take the streetcar there. And Draper willingly went and chaperoned her and told her she could invite a friend, whereas it turned out to be a large group of women. And although a little bit awkward, they still went on the streetcar, went to Georgetown, and came back with much less money than they had originally. And so they didn't have enough to actually take the streetcar, yet he lent them money and they made it back in good shape.
Draper was also recognized as a leader. He was very popular with our faculty here at Gallaudet at that time. There was an International Congress for the Deaf in Paris, France, and the faculty had to vote an individual to go and represent them. Draper was the person who was selected because of his international connections and his activism. They thought he would very well represent Gallaudet University, and you see him pictured there on the steamboat headed to Paris, France. As a result of that conference, he published a report upon return and then spoke about his experience and the information that he gathered there, sharing it with the Gallaudet community. Draper loved bike riding. I'm sure you've seen this picture around on campus in different places. And of course, he was always in the front of any group that was bike riding, considering the fact that he was such a leader, a very active leader. Hotchkiss is actually the 5th biker in the picture here. Draper was also one of the individuals that was very involved in fundraising, seeking to get money and writing letters, asking individuals to contribute money to construct this statue, the statue that we know that's here on campus. Not just that, but President Garfield's bust. So he was very instrumental in writing letters, trying to convince individuals to provide monies and funding to support those efforts. And as a result of his work, we continue to have that statue here on our campus. If you look at the statue as it is today, you will actually see recognition given to Draper for his work.
Draper was also a great advocate for curriculum change. He noticed that many students who came into the college at that time needed to focus more on their mathematics and their vocabulary growth, and so he very much wanted to prepare these students for a better life and for success in the college. Amos Draper was also a wonderful friend.
I wanted to share a kind of a funny story about Draper. He was friends with everyone. And just to give you an example, there was a given time where groups of students would often hang out in front of College Hall or Chapel Hall. They would be out there laughing it up and making a lot of noise. And some of the administrators were complaining about the noise and how students should be attending to work. And so they sent their complaints off to the president about the noise the students were making right outside the doors of the building. So the president instituted a policy called a no loafing policy, forbidding the students to gather and spend a lot of time in those areas, hoping that they would go back and attend to their studies. But it just so happened that one day, Draper approached the students and joined in on their conversations right outside of College Hall in that very spot. The students recognized that he was not following the university's policy, and so just for fun, one of the students went up to an upper level floor and on the chalkboard wrote these words, "No loafing here." The student opened the window and then lowered this sign down until it was right before Draper's eyes. Of course, it was a good reminder to him that he as well needed to follow the university policies. But nonetheless, he always was very thoughtful of the students, always there for them, supporting both them and the faculty. And as such, he was recognized as a friend to everyone. An interesting fact, maybe something that you're already aware of, but Draper and Edward Minor Gallaudet were also very good friends. They were friends for a number of years. When Draper had a son, he actually named him after Edward Minor Gallaudet. His son's name was Edward, and Edward had a son named Amos in honor of Amos Draper. So as you can see, they had a long-time friendship.
Many people question whether they were more than friends. That question is left unanswered, but the two of them had much respect for one another. Draper was Edward Minor Gallaudet's secretary. Their children grew up together. They were very close, and that question of whether they were more than friends or not is left unanswered, but we do know that they had a very close relationship, and anybody who's interested in looking into that further can do so.
And again, as mentioned, Draper had planned to come here to this campus to stay only 1 year, but ended up staying, 45 years, on first as a student and then as a faculty member.
Draper was a skilled writer as well as orator.
We have a movie to show you.
If you don't mind pausing this for a moment. Can we pause this? So as I was saying, he was a skilled orator and a public speaker. And he spoke mostly to young deaf children on the topic of learning. So he would talk to parents and children worldwide, regardless of size, color, or creed, about education and about the curiosity that is important for that lifelong learning. He also talked about independent living for deaf people upon graduation and how they can take care of themselves in society and be successful and independent. So he was very much a people person. Many people wrote about his beautiful oration, and we'll give you a very brief example here. We're not going to show you the whole thing. It's a 5-minute clip, but just so you can get an idea of who Dr. Draper was and his skill in oration. This is in 1913, and he is signing the charter that Abraham Lincoln signed at the founding of the college. This gentleman that you see here is Amos Draper, And so we'll give you just a moment to view his work, and hopefully this will have you thinking about this gentleman and how much he cared about the education of deaf people. So please enjoy this clip.
April of 1864. We encourage you to continue on in your studies. And that the legacy of many be carried on. And that you come to learn about topics and subjects throughout the world. And the spirit of learning be continued on. That you retain your beliefs, your hopes, and your dreams remain high and never fading.
So he actually spelled Lincoln here in talking about the charter and Lincoln signing the charter. That's a wonderful clip, I believe, very suited for us here today celebrating the 150th celebration of Lincoln signing the charter. So take a moment to read this screen. Dr. Draper played an enormous role in the history of Gallaudet. He was a great proponent of higher education. And he was one of the students who worked hard and became very successful and helped in the success of the college. He was a faculty member who was very active in his 45 years here, first as a tutor, then as a faculty member, as well as all the different roles. He was a secretary for the faculty, and 45 years took notes from all of their meetings. So he played a very important role in the success of the college. In 1917, he took his last breath. And 5 weeks after, that was 5 weeks after Edward Minor Gallaudet's death. He actually wrote the obituary for Edward Minor Gallaudet, and like I said, 5 weeks later himself passed. The memorial was held in Chapel Hall, and please take note of this quote on the slide. What a fitting way to close this presentation. Dr. Draper played such an important role in the history of Gallaudet. Thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you. We want to thank both of the presenters today, and we do have time for a couple of questions. The floor is open, and I would ask if you'd like to ask a question to come to the front of the room. After this, we will take a break, and during the break, you'll have an opportunity to approach the speakers individually as well. But for now, we'll entertain any questions from the floor.
Hello. I love watching that old video clip. It's truly inspiring. So taking a look at the information, I wanted to ask you, he received a doctorate from Gallaudet, correct? So shouldn't he be referred to as Dr. Draper? And when did Gallaudet University actually start conferring degrees?
Draper did not actually get or study to get a doctorate. He was given an honorary doctorate degree from the college. And I believe Hotchkiss as well. I don't know that for sure, but I can imagine that he also received a honorary doctorate.
Are there any other questions? If not, let's go ahead and take a break. We'll come back at 11 o'clock. 11 o'clock, we'll come back.